Forest fires such as these are seen all over Sierra Leone and are set alight by humans or sometimes by the sun in extremely high temperatures. Extensive damage to forest due to forest fire is one form of forest degradation that can be avoided. Deforestation is another form of forest destruction. Nearly 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions that alter the climate come from the burning of forest material or by the accelerated decay of this forest material due to deforestation. When forest is lost, its value as a carbon sink to absorb carbon is also lost. The absorption of carbon can be manipulated in a process called carbon sequestration, which is the placement of carbon gas away from the earth and into the water, the land, or the vegetation upon the land, such as a forest. Planting trees or safeguarding existing trees is the meaning of RED, reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation. RED Plus ensures that the quality of this carbon improves with the involvement and the sustainable livelihood assurances of the local community very close to the forest. The emissions referred to are carbon emissions, and the United States is the world's leading producer of carbon from its highly industrialized society. Chandler Van Voris works with the American Carbon Registry, one of the agencies responsible for finding buyers for carbon. As a subsidiary of the corporation Windrock International, they are also investing in carbon sequestration by planting extensive areas of fast-growing cottonwood trees. The place where this is done is the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. Chandler Van Voris.
We are a group of dedicated conservationists that have gotten involved in the carbon markets and some of the other ecosystem markets to help really do a lot of restoration work throughout. We focus in on the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, which really runs from Cairo, Illinois down to Baton Rouge. It's the Mississippi River. And so the office is really geared on anything to do with planting a tree and quantifying the growth of that tree for carbon credits, as well as we do a lot in the biomass space where we provide feedstock for clean energy. And so, anything that deals with the tree and deals with ecologic and climate issues, we're very involved in.
Located in the eastern state of Virginia, the American Carbon Registry is half a continent away from the project site in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. Here, in Little Rock, Arkansas, Andy Johnson is the middleman between the American Carbon Registry and Green Trees, a carbon sequestration project based in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, known as the rainforest of the United States.
We will be dividing the carbon assets that have been marketed. Well, it'll be at a rate of 50 to 50-50 with the landowner. We will split the carbon proceeds. There's a $25 an acre enrollment incentive, and of course when you combine green trees and particularly CP31, which is a bottomland hardwood restoration program, 90% of the cost of stand establishment is reimbursed to the landowner. Then he or she, as Brandon noted earlier, receives an annual payment for soil rental up to 120% of market value of rental rate. So there's a lot of incentive there for a landowner to get involved in these programs. Very lucrative. With our program, not only do we get carbon proceeds, but at age 10, the landowner has the prerogative to come in and take out every third row of cottonwoods in a harvest, and that is their income to keep.
Brandon Stafford is a landowner with access to thousands of acres. To him, carbon sequestration is just as important as crop farming.
Previously, this had been a dry land cotton farm. We were growing cotton without irrigation, and we were faced with a choice. It was either time to put in a well and which gets very expensive, or do a certain type of a conservation program. And we felt like it was our long-term best interest to do a conservation program.
Okay. Now, I realize that there is an awful lot of acreage down here in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley.
That's correct.
How successful do you think this program will be if other farmers like yourself, landowners like yourself, come on board this project?
Long term, I think it'll be very successful. Yeah.
Jamie Schuler is a professor of silviculture with the University of Arkansas School of Forest Resources Center. By comparing densities of seed distribution, planting distances, and various soil differences, he is helping green trees determine which field setup will be best for planting their cottonwood trees. He knows that the United States needs methodologies like these and the cooperation of landowners like Brandon Stafford to offset the carbon that will be required by law in the coming years. He also says the United States are not the only ones responsible.
This system is not gonna change the global carbon cycle by themselves. There's a lot of other things that we as people have to do as well, but they're certainly gonna benefit it to some degree.
Located on Broadway in New York City, Mark Morogue is an associate in the climate program of the Rainforest Alliance. The Rainforest Alliance belongs to the Forest Stewardship Council, which is one of the certifying bodies that can apply scientific and social criteria towards carbon projects which will help consumers buy the products or services that are most fair to the environment and their inhabitants.
Farming practices need to be restructured, revamped, and transformed to encourage environmental conservation, to foster robust business development, make these farms improve their profitability, improve their productivity, make them operate, enable them to operate in a competitive market environment, and really ensure that farming generates benefits for the communities, for the farm workers, and not just for the farm owners, although for them as well, by doing things like mandating or encouraging local medical facilities, local schools for the children of these farm workers. There's a tremendous amount of outreach, education, capacity building, and training that needs to be done at the field level. So working directly with community groups, with farmers, principally, for example, through farmer field schools that the Rainforest Alliance has, that basically introduce these best practices, demonstrate in very practical ways what farms or what foresters can do to adopt them, so that they're capable of achieving, of transforming their businesses and achieving these best practices in social benefits, social cohesion, environmental preservation, economic viability. I think it's from an interest amongst farming cooperatives, the cocoa associations, domestic within Sierra Leone, and some of the companies that source cocoa from Sierra Leone, like you mentioned. Just the interest, the awareness that these kinds of sustainable programs and practices exist, and understanding that with dedicated effort, work, and support, these kinds of best practices can be implemented in Sierra Leone amongst these cocoa cooperatives and groups, and support from and interest from the brands that would ultimately source that cocoa, to source it from certified production within your country, within Sierra Leone.
Climate change negotiations are converging annually to set up a global framework that will soon protect forests and co-manage the benefits with the indigenous people closest to the forest. The United States seems to want the same for the world as it does for its own population. As a lead polluting country interacting with least polluting Sierra Leone, programs have been introduced that are gradually improving resilience to climate change and protecting food, the most vital human asset. In Washington, D.C., Matthew Edwardson, Africa Program Coordinator in the United States Forest Service International Programs, knows about the frontier efforts by the United States devoted to climate change and food security. The Steward Program, Sustainable and Thriving Environments for West African Regional Development, is one of these efforts, concentrating on the Upper Guinea rainforest in the West African region, where Sierra Leone has distinctive portions, including the Otamba-Kilimi National Park. Part of the understanding desired between forest inhabitants and the outside world is evident in this mock debate. High school students who had never been to Sierra Leone took on the role of beneficiaries of the forest, forest authorities, civil society, and the private sector in a scenario that is typical of the dilemmas faced in natural resource management here in Sierra Leone. How much forest do we sacrifice for development is the question.
If our resources are depleted and taken away, more and more, there's less to show. And there's less that Sierra Leone can provide, and it's an awesome place, and to be able to show others how great it is when we have our resources depleted, you can't do that. You have to protect what you have so you can inform others on what you have.
Do you believe that for the long-term success of the OKNP, we need a healthy watershed, and we are concerned currently with the surrounding community members who are causing degradation of the OKNP and the surrounding forest zone, and we were looking into putting a firm and enforceable legal consequence in place of this.
For the education and for the population that'll be coming in for tourism and all that, to promote oil, the revenue of the country provides an education for everyone. The revenue of the country provides hotels and stuff that will support your tourism, will support the growing population. And not even hotels, just more homes, just everything in general.
Well, yeah, but the education just isn't the materialistic things. It's like the appreciation of the natural beauty and what we're provided. It's not the fact that you can luxuriously stay in a hotel and pay for education. It's not just education as in what you go to school for. It's education in your mind and how you think about things, and also in your heart and how you feel about certain situations. That kind of education. It's not just the education in your textbooks or the education that you find economically. It's within, and it's the natural beauty of the country.
So STEWARD stands for the Sustainable and Thriving Environments for West Africa Regional Development. It's a program that the U.S. Forest Service is implementing on behalf of the United States Agency for International Development. We work very closely with USAID in West Africa at their mission based out of Accra, along with the missions of USAID in Liberia and in Sierra Leone and Guinea. And what we're doing is working across the Mana River Union, as well as in Ghana, in different priority zones, different transboundary priority zones, so areas that have high biodiversity importance, to help those communities, those partners at the national, international, and the local level conserve those resources and achieve kind of sustainable economic growth at the local level as well over the long term. So we're working on fire management planning, we're working on forest management planning, we're working on regional policy harmonization with different government stakeholders. We're working on, in the future, looking at kind of climate change adaptation, how we can develop more resiliency amongst those communities, how we can also improve kind of water supply and sanitation in those communities. So STEWARD is really all about partnerships. It's all about really building local capacity, using local institutions, kind of living and off of and taking advantage of all of the different results which have been achieved over the years in West Africa, and trying to really develop those different communities for the longer term.
The funding for STEWARD comes in a large part from the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Dr. Tegan Blaine is Climate Change Advisor in USAID's Africa Bureau, also operating out of Washington, D.C.
starting very, very recently, we began to directly invest in climate change. Our programs are divided between mitigation, in other words, reducing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and adaptation, which is assuming that climate change is already happening and trying to address what we can do to reduce the vulnerability to climate change. So in the last year or so, we've actually begun addressing those issues very directly through our programs. In 2010, we have allocated about $53 million across Africa for both of these types of investments, and we're expecting that that will rise over the next couple of years. The presidential budget request for FY12 is more than twice that. It's about $126 million for programs all over sub-Saharan Africa. The kinds of things that we do in these two types of programs are very different. On the mitigation side, what we're really trying to do is reduce emissions of the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. And we do that both through investments in clean energy, so trying to generate energy through renewable sources of energy and through using energy more efficiently. And then also we do investments on land management, because how we manage land also influences the kinds of emissions that go to the atmosphere to cause climate change. On the adaptation side, our programs range across a whole variety of things. Part of the work that we're going to be doing is about science and analysis and how we improve the availability of information for decision making. Part of it's on the governance side. How do we get more people participating in decisions about how to address climate change within their own communities or at the national government? And then part of it is thinking about what we need to do within particular sectors to address climate change. For example, if you're beginning to plan water supply for a major growing urban center, are you actually planning for the kinds of capacity that you will need, storage capacity down the line? Are you taking into account how water availability might change and the rainfalls might shift to another time of the year, or you might get drier spells and wetter spells? So all of those kinds of things go into selecting strategies that will help communities or countries adapt to climate change.
All that we are asking from you is to make them work for you and to share your experience with them, and they will share with you. And we feel very confident that you will come out with new systems, new knowledge that complements your existing knowledge. That's what we're here for.
A lot of effort is apparent in U.S. efforts to address climate change and food security across the world, including developing countries like Sierra Leone. The United States government efforts goes beyond the Forest Service, and science plays a huge role in determining what policies are approved and which action plans are taken in the U.S. contribution to improve domestic and world food supplies and to combat climate change. At the United States Department of Agriculture's extensive facilities in Beltsville, Maryland, the crop response to more carbon is being analyzed using simulated air and soil environments. The result and methods are available on the internet and are urgently awaited for review by fellow researchers. The climate change policy of the United States can also rest on the United States Geological Survey's department. Climate change will bring higher temperatures resulting in drought. Dry areas such as the Tambaka Chiefdom, where United States programs are located, could lose their agricultural livelihoods. But there is a famine early warning system in place by the United States Geological Survey's department.
Well, my name is Matt Larson. I'm the Associate Director for Climate and Land Use Change programs here at the U.S. Geological Survey. And our suite of programs conducts several activities within the science area. We do basic research, we work in adaptation strategies as well as mitigation strategies. For example, we have a number of research programs in the Arctic, some that work in the tropics, some that work in temperate environments, looking at how climate is changing in those environments and how it's changing things like the distribution of species, the distribution of plants, the distribution of water resources, which is a particularly important one.
Our perspective in family early warning systems is first and foremost understanding the livelihood systems of the countries in question that might face food insecurity. From that, we get an understanding of the vulnerability to drought of these livelihood systems, different means of cropping and raising livestock and other ways of obtaining food and income. Family early warning then is vigilant for any sort of shock that might hit these livelihood systems. And they might be socioeconomic, such as a spike in prices in the markets, making food more expensive. But they might also come in the form of natural hazards like drought.
The United States' status as an informed society depends largely on its renowned centers of excellence in learning. Benjamin Cashore is a professor in the Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in New Haven, Connecticut. He is an authority on issues of deforestation and the plans that are being put in place to reduce climate change resulting from deforestation. He suggests that government forest authorities can decentralize their role under a larger framework of international compliance.
Yeah, we're saying that it is possible, that the state is not the only way in which you achieve and address really important environmental and social challenges facing forest management in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. So that we're not saying it is the better way. We're saying it's one pathway. And how might we better understand what is required for that pathway to work effectively and efficiently and to bring along stakeholders and civil society in that process. A lot of things are going on now that are really critical that don't just involve trying to have a global forest agreement where all nations agree to certain standards. This has proven very elusive, in part because countries want to manage the forests in ways they feel are appropriate and don't like the idea of having other countries dictate what they have to do. But we have found out that countries do want to learn about responsible forest practices. They do want to think about implementing important global norms. For example, the principle of subsidiarity, which basically means try and develop governance at the lowest level possible so that people in the forest can be meaningfully involved in the forest, is so dominant now that the World Bank, the FSC, the United Nations Forum on Forests, and others are all championing this principle as important to help countries achieve. This is the way in which important global mechanisms actually do have impacts in countries who in many ways benefit from and appreciate these kinds of activities.
There is a lot of documentation and preparation involved in getting a community or country into a position where payments can be received for forest protection and reforestation that, among other things, ensures food security and sustained livelihoods. But why should civil society or the indigenous residents around the Gola Forest, Western Area Peninsula Forest Reserve, and the Otamba-Kilimi National Park wait another 10 years for REDD+, as it is becoming known, to become internationally functional, or for Sierra Leone to build its central government capacity to market their forest as a carbon sink? The complexity of the arrangements behind any carbon project reflect how much the carbon is worth and the concern of carbon buyers that their investments are protected and certified. Forest Trends is helping to bring about changes that will deliver real conservation benefits to those who manage natural resources such as forests, water, and wildlife. At the Forest Trends office, Phil Covell is a business analyst and manager of the Katoomba Group Incubator for Ecosystem Services. From his discreet office in Washington, D.C.'s Georgetown, a wealth of information lies awaiting millions of people who depend on the forest as an intact asset.
And so part of the role of the project developer is to select a set of standards that will meet the needs of the project, that is something that can be implemented in a cost-effective way at the project level, but also have sufficient level of credibility at the global level to enable the sales of those assets. Certainly, the international protocols create some opportunity, creates the expectation that there might be a future demand for on a compliance basis. That is, they have a legal requirement to reduce carbon emissions. What happens, for example, if we protect this plot of land? Will the people who are formerly deforesting that plot of land just run over to this other plot and deforest that one all the more quickly? So that's a question of leakage. There's also the question of permanence. If we conserve a plot of forest today, what's to prevent it from being exploited or burned tomorrow or 2 years from now? So that's the question of permanence. And then there's the question of additionality, which is what is the so you say that because I'm paying you to preserve this forest, you're going to do it. But what's to say that you wouldn't have preserved that forest anyway? So how do I know that what I'm paying actually creates something additional? So these three issues of additionality, leakage, and permanence were three major concerns that caused the negotiators of Kyoto to really look very carefully and to set aside forest carbon as one of the tools that could be used to offset carbon emissions globally under these compliance regimes. Nowadays, there's an increasing awareness that we're not going to be able to resolve global climate issues without addressing forest carbon, because forest and other land-based emissions constitute, depending on who's counting, between 10 and 20% of global carbon emissions. So we're not going to get to the level of reductions that we need to get to if we don't really look seriously at carbon and somehow find forest carbon and find a way to include forest carbon in these compliance regimes.
Every day, Sierra Leone loses forest cover for economic gains that could equally come from the United States companies who want to offset the pollution they create by supporting nature and its conservation in places like the Otambakilimi National Park, the Western Area Peninsula Forest, and the Gola Forest. While Steward, the Sustainable and Thriving Environment for West African Regional Development, is one example of a U.S. government program directly protecting forests through knowledge transfer and food security by crop diversification support and soil conservation, several independent parties in the United States are advancing into the future to place a higher value on forests and ensuring that this value is fairly certified and accessible by those who themselves are the indigenous stewards of their environment. Independence, fairness, access, each is reflected in the research, advocacy, and instruction produced in the United States by government departments, learning institutions, and entrepreneurs, driven by a population with high consumer demands, but equally with a sense of stewardship for the environment and the implications for the world's future if this environment is properly cared for.